The German supply depot lay in darkness except for scattered security lights that cast long shadows across the compound. Lydia Litviak crouched in the tree line, studying the guard rotations she had observed throughout the afternoon. Her plan required precise timing and flawless execution, as any mistake would result in facing 15 armed soldiers simultaneously while trapped in an open compound. At exactly midnight, she began her approach to the perimeter fence. The guards had established a pattern that created a brief window of opportunity every 20 minutes when the eastern section of the compound was temporarily unobserved. Her injuries made silent movement difficult, but her survival training had emphasized that stealth was often more important than speed in hostile territory. The fence proved easier to penetrate than expected. German forces had become overconfident due to their deep position behind friendly lines, and their security measures were designed more to deter local civilians than trained military personnel. Lydia cut through the wire mesh using her survival knife, creating an opening large enough to crawl through without triggering any alarm systems. Inside the perimeter, she moved between shadows created by stacked supply crates and parked vehicles. The compound was larger than it had appeared from her observation position, containing ammunition storage bunkers, fuel tanks, a motor pool, and what appeared to be a field communications center. The diversity of targets presented both opportunities and challenges for her sabotage mission. Her primary objective was the communications center, housed in a reinforced wooden building near the center of the compound. Destroying this facility would prevent the depot from coordinating with other German forces during her escape. However, the building was positioned where it could be observed from multiple guard posts, making a stealthy approach extremely difficult. The fuel storage area offered her best opportunity for creating maximum destruction with minimum exposure time. 6 large tanks contained gasoline, diesel fuel, and lubricants essential for German mechanized operations. A well-placed explosive charge could create secondary explosions that would destroy much of the depot while providing cover for her escape. Lydia had fabricated improvised explosive devices using ammunition from her captured German equipment and materials found in her survival kit. The charges were small but strategically placed to maximize damage to critical systems. Her engineering knowledge, acquired through intensive pilot training, proved valuable for calculating the most effective placement of limited explosives. The first charge was positioned beneath the central fuel tank, timed to detonate after she had targeted other critical systems. The second charge was placed in the ammunition storage bunker, where it would cause sympathetic detonations of stored ordnance. The third and most critical charge was positioned in the communications center, timed to explode first and prevent enemy forces from calling for reinforcements. As she moved through the compound, Lydia encountered her first serious obstacle. A German sentry was conducting an unscheduled security check that brought him directly toward her position. She had approximately 30 seconds before being discovered, forcing her to make a split-second decision between abandoning the mission or eliminating the guard. Her close-quarters combat training proved decisive in the brief but violent encounter. The German soldier was eliminated silently, but his absence would be noticed when he failed to report at the next scheduled check-in time. This gave Lydia perhaps 15 minutes to complete her sabotage mission and escape before the compound went on full alert. The communications center proved to be more heavily defended than anticipated. 2 soldiers were manning radio equipment inside the building, while another guard was positioned outside. Her original plan of placing explosives and withdrawing was no longer viable. She would need to assault the position directly to complete her mission. The attack began with her engaging the outside guard from concealment. Her suppressed pistol, acquired from the German observation post, eliminated the sentry without alerting the radio operators inside. However, she now had to enter the building and deal with 2 more enemy soldiers while working against an extremely tight timeline. The interior assault required speed and precision that pushed her combat skills to their absolute limits. Both German radio operators were armed and experienced soldiers who reacted quickly to the threat. The confined space of the communications center became a deadly arena where fractions of seconds determined life or death outcomes. Lydia's military training had emphasized that close-quarters combat was often decided by psychological factors rather than pure marksmanship. Her unexpected appearance in what the Germans considered a secure rear area facility provided a brief tactical advantage that proved decisive. However, the engagement resulted in significant noise that would certainly alert other guards throughout the compound. With the communications center secured, she had approximately 10 minutes before her improvised explosive charges would begin detonating. This was sufficient time to reach the compound perimeter and begin her escape, but only if she encountered no further resistance. The German guards who remained alive in the compound were beginning to realize that something was seriously wrong. Her escape route took her through the motor pool, where dozens of military vehicles were parked in organized rows. These trucks, staff cars, and motorcycles represented significant German logistical capabilities that could be damaged with minimal additional effort. Lydia used her remaining small explosive charges to disable as many vehicles as possible. The first explosion came from the communications center exactly as planned, sending flames and debris high into the night sky. The destruction was so complete that the building was reduced to scattered wreckage within seconds. German forces throughout the compound immediately began responding to what they correctly identified as a deliberate enemy attack. Lydia reached the perimeter fence as the second explosion erupted from the ammunition bunker. The sympathetic detonations of stored ordnance created a chain reaction that continued for several minutes, sending projectiles and shrapnel across the entire depot. The noise and destruction were visible for many kilometers, certainly alerting German forces throughout the region. The final fuel tank explosion occurred as she was crawling through her previously prepared hole in the fence. The blast wave knocked her to the ground and temporarily stunned her, but the massive fireball that erupted behind her confirmed that the sabotage mission had achieved complete success. The German supply depot was effectively destroyed as a functional military facility. However, her escape was complicated by the immediate response of German forces in the area. Vehicle engines started on nearby roads as enemy units moved to investigate the explosions and search for the attackers. Aircraft could be heard overhead, probably reconnaissance planes equipped with searchlights for night operations. Lydia's movement away from the depot was aided by the chaos and destruction she had created, but also hindered by her deteriorating physical condition. The combat stress and physical exertion had worsened her injuries, particularly the head trauma that caused increasing periods of dizziness and confusion. Her ammunition was nearly exhausted, leaving her vulnerable if she encountered additional enemy forces. The forest provided temporary concealment, but German search teams were systematically combing the area, using coordinated tactics that gradually narrowed her escape options. Dogs were being employed to track her scent trail, while aircraft maintained aerial surveillance of all possible routes towards Soviet territory. The enemy response was professional and thorough. Her captured maps indicated a possible escape route through a series of river valleys that led generally toward friendly territory. However, this route would require crossing several German defensive positions and navigating terrain that became increasingly difficult as it approached the front lines. The journey would take at least 3 days, assuming she could avoid capture and maintain her current pace. The first major river crossing presented immediate challenges. German forces had established a checkpoint at the only bridge in the area, while the water was too deep and swift for safe crossing by someone with her injuries. Lydia was forced to move several kilometers upstream before finding a location where crossing was possible without drowning. The river crossing nearly proved fatal as her injured shoulder made swimming extremely difficult, and the current was stronger than anticipated. She lost most of her remaining equipment during the crossing, retaining only her sidearm, compass, and a small amount of food. Her survival now depended entirely on reaching friendly forces before her physical condition deteriorated beyond the point where movement was possible. On the far side of the river, she discovered evidence of recent Soviet military activity. Shell craters, abandoned equipment, and defensive positions suggested that her own forces had operated in this area within the past few weeks. This provided hope that she was moving in the correct direction, but also indicated that German forces would be particularly alert for Soviet infiltrators. Her progress was slowed by the need to avoid German patrols that were conducting systematic searches of the area. The enemy forces appeared to be operating under the assumption that multiple Soviet agents were involved in the depot attack, leading them to establish checkpoints and conduct area sweeps that made movement extremely dangerous. Lydia's physical condition reached a critical point as she entered the third day of her escape attempt. The head injury was causing severe headaches and periods of unconsciousness, while her other injuries had become infected due to the lack of proper medical treatment. She was surviving on a handful of berries and water from streams, having exhausted her emergency rations the previous day. The sound of artillery fire in the distance provided the first indication that she was approaching the front lines. However, determining which side was conducting the bombardment proved impossible from her position. Both Soviet and German forces were known to use similar weapons, and the confused tactical situation in the area made identification extremely difficult. Her final major obstacle came in the form of a German defensive position that completely blocked her planned route toward friendly territory. The position consisted of machine gun nests, mortar positions, and at least 30 soldiers who appeared to be preparing for an expected Soviet attack. Bypassing this position would require a lengthy detour through terrain that offered little concealment. Lydia made the decision to attempt penetrating the German lines during the cover of darkness. Her reasoning was that enemy forces would be focused on defending against attack from the front, potentially making them less vigilant against infiltration from behind their positions. However, this approach required her to cross open ground while in a severely weakened condition. The infiltration attempt began well as she successfully bypassed the outer sentries and reached the main defensive perimeter. However, her weakened condition caused her to make noise while crossing a section of wire obstacles, alerting a German machine gun crew to her presence. The resulting firefight would determine whether her incredible journey ended in success or failure. The engagement with the German machine gun position required her to use her final ammunition while facing multiple enemy soldiers in prepared defensive positions. Her pilot training had included extensive ground combat instruction, but nothing could have fully prepared her for fighting alone against determined enemies while suffering from multiple injuries and exhaustion. The battle lasted several minutes that felt like hours, with Lydia using every tactical technique she had learned to survive against overwhelming odds. Her superior knowledge of individual combat tactics, combined with the element of surprise, proved decisive against enemies who had expected to face massed infantry attacks rather than a lone infiltrator. Victory came at enormous cost as she expended her last ammunition and sustained additional injuries during the close-quarters fighting. However, the German defensive position had been neutralized, opening a route toward what she hoped were Soviet positions. Her condition was now so deteriorated that she could barely walk, but the sound of familiar voices speaking Russian in the distance provided motivation to continue. The final approach to friendly lines nearly ended in disaster when Soviet sentries opened fire on what they assumed was a German infiltrator. Only her knowledge of current recognition signals, combined with her ability to speak fluent Russian, prevented her from being killed by her own forces after surviving everything the Germans had thrown at her. Senior Lieutenant Lydia Litviak collapsed into the arms of Soviet soldiers who could hardly believe the story she told them. Over the course of 3 days, she had destroyed a major German supply depot, fought running battles with over 60 enemy soldiers, and walked nearly 50 kilometers through hostile territory while suffering from multiple serious injuries. Her debriefing provided valuable intelligence about German defensive positions, troop movements, and tactical procedures. The information she had gathered during her escape helped Soviet forces plan subsequent operations that resulted in significant tactical victories. Her personal courage had produced strategic benefits that extended far beyond her individual survival. Medical examination revealed the full extent of her injuries and the remarkable feat of endurance she had accomplished. Fractured ribs, a severe concussion, infected wounds, and malnutrition should have made survival impossible under the conditions she had faced. Military doctors described her recovery as nothing short of miraculous. The official recognition of her accomplishments came in the form of decorations that acknowledged both her original flying achievements and her extraordinary ground combat performance. However, Lydia was most satisfied by the knowledge that her actions had contributed to eventual Soviet victory and the liberation of her homeland from enemy occupation. Her story became legendary among Soviet pilots and ground forces, serving as an example of what individual courage and determination could accomplish against seemingly impossible odds. The young woman who had been shot down behind enemy lines had demonstrated that the human spirit could overcome any obstacle when fighting for principles worth defending. Years after the war ended, military historians would study her escape as a textbook example of survival, evasion, resistance, and escape techniques. Her tactical decisions, improvised weapons usage, and psychological resilience provided lessons that would benefit future generations of military personnel facing similar challenges. Lydia Litviak returned to flying duties after her recovery, continuing to serve with distinction until the end of the war. Her experience behind enemy lines had changed her perspective on combat, but had also strengthened her resolve to contribute to final victory over the forces that had threatened her nation and way of life. The supply depot she had destroyed remained out of operation for the remainder of the war, depriving German forces of critical logistical support during several major operations. Her actions during those 3 days in enemy territory had strategic implications that extended far beyond her personal survival, demonstrating how individual heroism could influence the outcome of much larger conflicts. Her legacy continued long after the war ended, inspiring countless others to persist in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. The young pilot who had taken on 60 enemies alone and emerged victorious had proven that courage, skill, and determination could overcome any odds when fighting for something greater than oneself. The Yak-1 fighter aircraft struck the forest canopy at nearly 200 kilometers per hour, its damaged engine finally seizing completely. Lydia Litviak fought to maintain control as branches shattered against her windscreen, and the aircraft careened through the dense pine forest. The landing gear had been destroyed during the air battle, forcing her to attempt a belly landing on terrain completely unsuitable for aircraft operations. The crash sequence lasted only seconds but felt like an eternity. Her aircraft's wings were torn away by massive tree trunks, the fuselage spinning sideways before coming to rest against a large boulder. The sudden deceleration threw Lydia forward against her restraint harness with tremendous force, stunning her and causing multiple injuries. When the motion finally stopped, she found herself suspended upside down in the wreckage of her fighter plane. Smoke began rising from the engine compartment, and the smell of aviation fuel indicated a serious fire hazard. Despite her injuries and disorientation, Lydia's survival training took over. She released her harness and dropped to what had been the cockpit roof, then began the process of extracting herself from the twisted metal that had once been her aircraft. Every movement brought sharp pain, but the alternative was burning to death in the wreckage. Her survival kit had remained intact during the crash, secured in a compartment behind the pilot's seat. The kit contained emergency rations for 3 days, a first aid kit, water purification tablets, a compass, maps of the local area, and her sidearm with 2 spare magazines. Standard equipment for operations behind enemy lines, though no training had adequately prepared her for the reality of being alone in enemy territory with significant injuries. The forest around the crash site was eerily quiet except for the settling sounds of cooling metal and dripping fluids. Lydia took inventory of her physical condition while listening for signs of approaching enemy forces. Her left shoulder appeared to be dislocated, several ribs were likely cracked, and she had sustained a head injury that caused persistent dizziness. However, she could walk, and her vision was clear, which meant escape remained possible. German voices echoed through the forest approximately 15 minutes after the crash. The enemy forces had tracked her aircraft's descent and were systematically searching the area. From their radio chatter, which Lydia understood due to her language training, she determined that at least 20 soldiers were participating in the search operation. They were professional in their approach, establishing a perimeter and moving methodically through the dense undergrowth. Lydia moved away from the crash site as quickly as her injuries permitted, using techniques learned during survival training. She avoided obvious paths, stayed in dense cover, and carefully concealed any signs of her passage. The German search teams were thorough but not familiar with the specific terrain, giving her a slight advantage in the deadly game of hide and seek that was beginning. The first German patrol passed within 50 meters of her hiding position behind a fallen log. Through the vegetation, she could observe their equipment and tactics. They carried standard infantry weapons, portable radios, and what appeared to be tracking equipment. Their leader, a sergeant based on his insignia, directed the search with professional competence that suggested extensive combat experience. As the search expanded, Lydia realized that simply hiding would not ensure her survival. The German forces had unlimited time and manpower to conduct their operation, while she had limited supplies and significant injuries that would worsen without medical attention. Escape required reaching friendly forces, but the nearest Soviet positions were over 50 kilometers away through territory completely controlled by enemy forces. Her first priority was creating distance between herself and the search teams. Moving during daylight presented enormous risks, but remaining near the crash site guaranteed capture. Lydia began a careful withdrawal deeper into the forest, using terrain features and vegetation to mask her movement. Every step required constant vigilance for enemy patrols and potential ambush positions. The forest environment provided both advantages and challenges for her escape attempt. Dense vegetation offered concealment, but made movement slow and difficult. Streams provided fresh water, but also created natural choke points where ambushes could be established. Game trails offered easier movement, but were obvious routes that enemy patrols would certainly monitor. 2 hours after the crash, Lydia encountered her first major obstacle. A German checkpoint had been established at a bridge crossing a significant stream. The position was manned by at least 6 soldiers with a heavy machine gun and radio communications. Bypassing this obstacle would require either a lengthy detour through difficult terrain or finding an alternative crossing point. She chose to observe the checkpoint from concealment, learning the patterns of the guards and identifying weaknesses in their defensive setup. The soldiers appeared relaxed, suggesting they did not expect serious opposition in this area. However, their positioning covered all obvious approach routes, and the machine gun could deliver devastating firepower against anyone attempting to cross the bridge. While studying the checkpoint, Lydia overheard radio communications that provided crucial intelligence about enemy operations in the area. The German forces were conducting a major offensive operation, with multiple divisions moving toward new positions. This explained why her escape route toward friendly forces had been blocked by unexpected enemy positions. The radio traffic also revealed that German forces were actively searching for the downed Soviet pilot. Her successful bombing mission had caused significant disruption to their logistics operations, making her capture a priority. Rewards had been offered for information leading to her apprehension, and local civilian populations were being questioned about any unusual activities in the area. Lydia decided to attempt crossing the stream approximately 1 kilometer upstream from the checkpoint. This required moving through particularly dense forest and crossing terrain that appeared almost impassable. However, the alternative was remaining trapped between the search teams and the checkpoint, which would inevitably result in capture. The upstream crossing attempt proved more difficult than anticipated. The stream was deeper and faster than it appeared from a distance, and her injuries made swimming extremely challenging. The current carried her much further downstream than intended, bringing her dangerously close to the German checkpoint. Only quick thinking and careful use of overhanging vegetation prevented her from being spotted by enemy sentries. On the far side of the stream, Lydia found herself in an area that showed signs of recent military activity. Shell craters, abandoned equipment, and hastily constructed defensive positions indicated that fighting had occurred here within the past few days. This could mean that friendly forces had been in the area recently, but it also suggested that German forces were familiar with the terrain. Her progress was interrupted by the sound of approaching vehicles. A German military convoy was using a road that paralleled her planned route, forcing her to remain concealed until it passed. The convoy consisted of trucks loaded with troops, supply vehicles, and several armored cars. The size of the force indicated that German operations in the area were more extensive than intelligence reports had suggested. After the convoy passed, Lydia continued her movement toward what she hoped were friendly positions. However, her physical condition was deteriorating steadily. The head injury caused periods of confusion and dizziness, while her dislocated shoulder made using her arms extremely difficult. The lack of proper medical attention meant that her condition would likely worsen before she could reach safety. Evening brought new challenges as temperatures began dropping and visibility decreased. Moving in darkness reduced the risk of detection but increased the danger of becoming lost or injured in the difficult terrain. Lydia decided to find a secure hiding place and rest until dawn, using the time to tend to her injuries and plan the next phase of her escape. Her hiding place was a natural depression beneath the roots of a massive tree that had been uprooted during recent fighting. The position offered concealment from above and protection from the elements while providing good observation of the surrounding area. She used her first aid kit to treat her injuries as best possible, though the dislocated shoulder required medical attention beyond her capabilities. During the night, German patrols passed through the area multiple times. Their use of flashlights and loud conversation suggested they were not expecting to encounter enemy forces, but their presence confirmed that the entire region was under active enemy control. Any attempt to signal friendly aircraft or ground forces would likely result in immediate detection by German forces. Dawn brought the sound of aircraft engines overhead. German reconnaissance planes were conducting systematic searches of the forest, probably using photography to identify potential hiding places and escape routes. Lydia remained motionless in her concealment as aircraft passed directly overhead, knowing that any movement could result in detection and subsequent capture or death. The aerial reconnaissance was followed by renewed ground searches. The German forces had apparently expanded their operation, bringing in additional troops and specialized tracking equipment. Dogs could be heard barking in the distance, suggesting that enemy forces were using every available method to locate the downed Soviet pilot. Lydia's situation was becoming desperate. Her food supplies would last only 2 more days. Her injuries required medical attention, and the German search operation was intensifying rather than decreasing. Remaining hidden was no longer a viable strategy, but attempting to move during daylight seemed equally dangerous. The decision to resume movement came when she observed a German patrol establishing a permanent position less than 200 meters from her hiding place. The enemy forces were systematically occupying all potential hiding spots, making it only a matter of time before her concealment was discovered. Movement during daylight presented enormous risks, but remaining stationary guaranteed capture. Her route took her through areas that had been heavily damaged by artillery fire. Crater holes provided temporary concealment, but also created a landscape that was difficult to navigate quickly. The destroyed vegetation reduced natural cover, while the churned earth made silent movement nearly impossible. Every step had to be carefully planned to avoid detection. The first close encounter with enemy forces came when Lydia stumbled into a German observation post that had been camouflaged among the destroyed trees. 2 soldiers were manning the position, equipped with binoculars and radio communications. She was within 10 meters of their position before realizing the danger, forcing her to rely on the element of surprise for survival. Her military training had included extensive instruction in close-quarters combat, but actual application against armed enemy soldiers was entirely different from training exercises. The 2 German soldiers were experienced combat veterans who reacted quickly to her unexpected appearance. However, they had become complacent due to the lack of enemy activity in the area, giving Lydia a brief tactical advantage. The engagement lasted less than 30 seconds but required split-second decisions that would determine whether she lived or died. Her sidearm proved effective at close range, but the sound of gunfire would certainly alert other German forces in the area. She had perhaps 10 minutes to gather any useful equipment and escape before enemy reinforcements arrived at the observation post. The German soldiers had carried detailed maps of the local area, radio codes, and information about enemy troop dispositions. This intelligence could prove valuable for planning her escape route, but studying it required time she did not have. Lydia grabbed the most relevant items and began moving away from the observation post as quickly as her injuries permitted. Radio chatter erupted across German frequencies as news of the engagement spread through enemy forces. The casual search operation transformed into an active manhunt, with dozens of soldiers converging on the area. Aircraft appeared overhead within minutes, circling the observation post and expanding their search patterns to cover possible escape routes. Lydia's tactical situation had fundamentally changed. The enemy now knew her approximate location and would respond accordingly. Stealth and concealment were no longer sufficient for survival. She needed to actively fight her way toward friendly territory. This meant engaging superior enemy forces with limited ammunition while suffering from significant injuries. Her captured maps revealed that the nearest confirmed Soviet positions were still over 40 kilometers away, but they also showed potential routes that avoided major German strongpoints. However, these routes led through terrain that was difficult to traverse quickly, and they passed near several smaller enemy positions that could pose significant threats to a lone escapee. The chase began in earnest as German forces deployed in a coordinated effort to capture or kill the Soviet pilot. Lydia could hear vehicles moving on nearby roads and aircraft maintaining constant aerial surveillance. The enemy was treating her escape attempt as a significant military operation rather than a simple search for a downed pilot. Her next major obstacle was a German supply depot that controlled a key road junction. The facility was heavily guarded and represented a significant threat to her escape route. However, bypassing it would add many kilometers to her journey and force her through terrain that offered little concealment. The decision to attack rather than avoid would require careful planning and perfect execution. Lydia spent 2 hours observing the supply depot from a concealed position, learning the patterns of the guards and identifying the most vulnerable approaches. The facility contained ammunition, fuel, and communications equipment that would be valuable targets if she could destroy them. However, the depot was defended by at least 15 soldiers with automatic weapons and had radio contact with nearby German units. The attack plan required creating multiple diversions while focusing her main effort on the most critical targets. Destroying the communications center would prevent the depot from calling for reinforcements, while igniting the fuel storage would create chaos and provide cover for her escape. However, the plan required her to penetrate well-defended positions while significantly outnumbered. As evening approached, Lydia prepared for what would likely be her most dangerous engagement since being shot down. The supply depot attack would either provide her with the resources and tactical advantage needed for escape, or it would result in her death or capture. There were no other viable options remaining, and her deteriorating physical condition made immediate action imperative. The young Soviet pilot who had begun this ordeal as a successful fighter ace was about to face her greatest challenge. Alone, injured, and surrounded by enemy forces, she would need to rely on her training, courage, and determination to survive what appeared to be an impossible situation. The war had become a personal battle for survival against overwhelming odds. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Russian steppes as Senior Lieutenant Lydia Litviak adjusted her goggles one final time. The year was 1943, and the war had already claimed too many of her friends. At 21 years old, she had become one of the Soviet Union's most feared fighter pilots, known to the Germans as the White Lily of Stalingrad. Her blonde hair, usually hidden beneath her leather flight helmet, caught the early light as she performed her pre-flight checks on her Yakovlev Yak-1 fighter aircraft. The aircraft bore the scars of countless missions. Bullet holes patched with metal, paint worn thin from the constant exposure to combat conditions, and the personal touches that made it uniquely hers. A small white lily painted on the fuselage served as both her calling card and a reminder of home. The mechanics had worked through the night to ensure her plane was ready for what intelligence reports suggested would be a crucial mission. Lydia's commanding officer, Major Kozlov, approached with the mission briefings clutched in his weathered hands. His face bore the weight of sending young pilots into what many considered suicide missions. The German forces had been pushing hard along the southern front, and Soviet reconnaissance had identified a significant enemy buildup near a strategically important railroad junction. The mission required precision bombing of enemy supply lines while providing air cover for ground forces attempting to retake the area. The weather reports indicate clear skies for the next 6 hours, Major Kozlov explained, spreading the maps across the wing of her aircraft. You'll be flying with Lieutenant Petrov and Sergeant Mikhailov in a three-plane formation. The primary target is here. He pointed to a location marked in red ink approximately 200 kilometers behind enemy lines. Intelligence suggests heavy anti-aircraft positions, so maintain altitude until the final approach. Lydia studied the maps carefully, memorizing every detail of the terrain. The target area was surrounded by dense forest, which could provide cover if needed, but also concealed enemy positions. Rivers snaked through the landscape, offering navigation landmarks, but also potential obstacles for any emergency landing. The nearest friendly forces were over 50 kilometers away, making this deep penetration mission particularly dangerous. Her fellow pilots arrived as she completed her inspection. Lieutenant Petrov, a veteran of the Moscow defense, carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had survived when many others had not. Sergeant Mikhailov, younger than Lydia by 2 years, still possessed the eagerness that combat experience had not yet tempered. Together, they represented one of the most effective fighter squadrons in their regiment. The three pilots gathered around the mission map one final time. Radio frequencies were confirmed, emergency procedures reviewed, and contingency plans discussed. The importance of maintaining formation discipline was emphasized, as breaking formation in enemy airspace often meant death. Each pilot carried a sidearm, emergency rations, a first aid kit, and a compass. Standard procedure for operations behind enemy lines. As they prepared to board their aircraft, Lydia noticed the ground crews had painted fresh kill marks on her fuselage. 12 confirmed aerial victories, each represented by a small German cross. She had become an ace 3 times over, but the weight of those victories never became easier to bear. Each mark represented not just her skill as a pilot, but also someone who would never return home to their family. The engines roared to life in sequence, filling the morning air with the distinctive sound of Soviet engineering. Lydia's Yak 1 responded smoothly to her controls as she taxied into position. Radio checks confirmed all systems operational, and weather updates indicated continued favorable conditions. The control tower granted takeoff clearance, and the 3 aircraft began their roll down the dirt airstrip. Lydia felt the familiar surge of acceleration as her aircraft gained speed. The ground fell away beneath her, and, within minutes, the airfield had shrunk to a small collection of buildings and runways. She settled into formation with her wingmen, adjusting her position to maintain proper spacing. The countryside below showed the scars of war, burned villages, destroyed bridges, and the geometric patterns of defensive positions carved into the earth. Navigation to the target area required flying over both friendly and contested territory. Radio chatter from ground control provided updates on enemy air activity, but the early morning seemed unusually quiet. This concerned Lydia more than heavy enemy presence would have. In her experience, quiet skies often preceded major German offensive operations. 30 minutes into the flight, they encountered their first challenge. A bank of clouds had formed along their planned route, reducing visibility and forcing the formation to fly at a lower altitude than preferred. This increased their vulnerability to ground-based anti-aircraft fire but maintained their ability to navigate using visual landmarks. Lydia made the decision to continue the mission rather than abort and return to base. The landscape below gradually changed from the familiar territory near their base to areas that had been under German control for months. Roads showed signs of recent military traffic, and smoke columns in the distance indicated ongoing ground combat. Several times, they observed German aircraft in the distance, but no direct contact was made. The enemy appeared to be conserving their air assets for larger operations. As they approached the target area, Lieutenant Petrov's voice crackled over the radio. "White Lily, I count multiple anti-aircraft positions around the railroad junction. Recommend we approach from the southeast to use the forest cover." His tactical assessment proved accurate as Lydia observed the distinctive muzzle flashes of German flak guns positioned in a defensive perimeter around their objective. The target itself exceeded their expectations. Instead of a simple supply depot, they discovered a major German logistics hub. trains loaded with military equipment, fuel trucks arranged in organized formations, and what appeared to be a field headquarters with multiple communication antennas. The intelligence value of this discovery was enormous, but it also meant the area would be heavily defended. Lydia coordinated the attack approach, assigning specific targets to each pilot. She would focus on the fuel depot, as destroying it would create secondary explosions that could damage surrounding facilities. Lieutenant Petrov would target the communications center, potentially disrupting German coordination in the sector. Sergeant Mikhailov would strafe the train yards to prevent the movement of supplies and equipment. The diving attack began with Lydia leading the formation in a steep descent toward the target. Anti-aircraft fire immediately erupted from multiple positions, filling the sky with deadly bursts of shrapnel and tracer rounds. Her aircraft shuddered as nearby explosions rocked the air around her, but she maintained her attack course with determined precision. Her guns opened fire at optimal range, sending streams of bullets into the fuel storage area. The results exceeded all expectations as massive explosions erupted across the depot. Secondary blasts sent debris hundreds of feet into the air, and thick black smoke began billowing across the entire facility. The destruction was so complete that it momentarily stunned even the anti-aircraft gunners. Lieutenant Petrov's attack on the communications center proved equally successful. His precise gunnery destroyed multiple radio towers and what appeared to be a command bunker. Sergeant Mikhailov's strafing run across the rail yards derailed 2 locomotives and destroyed several freight cars loaded with military supplies. The coordinated attack had achieved complete tactical surprise and devastating results. However, their success came at a cost. As the formation climbed away from the target area, German fighter aircraft appeared on the horizon. Intelligence had failed to identify a nearby airfield, and enemy pilots were scrambling to intercept the Soviet attack force. The situation quickly transformed from a successful bombing mission to a desperate air battle for survival. Lydia counted at least 8 German fighters approaching from multiple directions. The enemy aircraft appeared to be a mixture of Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, representing some of Germany's most capable fighter planes. Against these odds, the 3 Soviet pilots would need to rely on superior tactics, intimate knowledge of their aircraft capabilities, and more than a little luck. The air battle began as the German formation split into 2 groups. 4 fighters moved to cut off the Soviet escape route, while the remaining 4 attempted to engage them immediately. Lydia ordered her wingmen to maintain tight formation while she maneuvered to gain a tactical advantage. Her experience in aerial combat had taught her that patience and precise timing often determine the outcome of such encounters. The first engagement came when a Messerschmitt attempted to attack Sergeant Mikhailov from above. Lydia executed a sharp climbing turn that brought her guns to bear on the German fighter. Her burst caught the enemy aircraft in the engine compartment, causing it to trail smoke and break off the attack. 1 German fighter was damaged, but 7 remained fully operational. Lieutenant Petrov engaged 2 Focke-Wulf fighters that had attempted to trap him in a scissors maneuver. His superior knowledge of his aircraft's capabilities allowed him to reverse the situation, forcing 1 German pilot to break off and putting him in position to damage the second fighter. However, this engagement separated him from the main formation, leaving him isolated against superior numbers. Lydia found herself fighting a running battle against multiple enemy aircraft while trying to maintain contact with her wingmen. Her Yak 1 possessed excellent maneuverability at lower altitudes, but the German fighters had advantages in speed and climb rate. The battle became a deadly game of 3-dimensional chess, with each pilot trying to position themselves for the perfect shot while avoiding becoming someone else's target. Sergeant Mikhailov's aircraft took several hits during a head-on pass with a Messerschmitt. His radio transmission indicated engine problems and possible fuel system damage. Lydia immediately moved to provide cover for the younger pilot, but this left her vulnerable to attack from other German fighters. The tactical situation was rapidly deteriorating despite their initial success against the ground targets. The battle continued for nearly 15 minutes, with both sides suffering casualties. Lydia managed to shoot down 1 German fighter and damage another, But Lieutenant Petrov's aircraft had been hit multiple times. His radio calls indicated serious mechanical problems and a wounded pilot. The decision to withdraw became imperative as their fuel supplies diminished and aircraft damage accumulated. Lydia coordinated a fighting withdrawal toward friendly territory, using cloud cover and terrain features to break contact with the remaining German fighters. However, the enemy pilots proved persistent, continuing to harass the Soviet formation even as they approached the front lines. The expectation of safety near friendly territory proved optimistic as German ground forces had positioned anti-aircraft guns along likely escape routes. The final challenge came as they crossed what should have been the front line. Instead of friendly Soviet positions, they encountered German ground forces who had apparently advanced during their mission. Heavy anti-aircraft fire erupted from unexpected positions, catching the already damaged Soviet aircraft in a deadly crossfire. The situation had become desperate with enemy forces both above and below. Sergeant Mikhailov's aircraft finally succumbed to the accumulated damage. His engine failed completely, forcing him to attempt an emergency landing in territory now confirmed to be under German control. Lydia watched helplessly as his Yak-1 disappeared below the tree line, hoping the young pilot had survived the crash, but knowing his chances of evading capture were minimal. Lieutenant Petrov's condition continued to deteriorate as his aircraft lost altitude and speed. His radio transmissions became increasingly weak and confused, indicating possible head injuries in addition to his mechanical problems. Lydia made the difficult decision to stay with her wounded wingman rather than attempting to escape at maximum speed. Her loyalty to fellow pilots had always been absolute, regardless of the personal cost. The final moments of the air battle came as German fighters made one last coordinated attack. Lieutenant Petrov's aircraft, already critically damaged, took additional hits that started a major fire in the cockpit area. His last radio transmission was barely audible, but Lydia understood his intention to ram the nearest German fighter rather than burn to death. The explosion that followed eliminated both aircraft and reminded her that the war demanded terrible sacrifices from those who fought it. Lydia found herself alone in hostile airspace, with her aircraft damaged, fuel running low, and multiple enemy fighters still pursuing her. The successful completion of their primary mission seemed meaningless in the face of losing both wingmen. Her training had prepared her for many scenarios, but fighting alone against overwhelming odds while deep in enemy territory represented the ultimate test of her skills and determination. The landscape below offered few options for emergency landing sites. Dense forest covered most of the terrain, with occasional clearings that appeared too small for safe aircraft operations. German military traffic was visible on several roads, indicating active enemy presence throughout the area. Any attempt to land would likely result in immediate capture or worse. Her aircraft's engine began showing signs of serious damage from the prolonged combat. Oil pressure was dropping, coolant temperature rising, and several instruments had been destroyed by enemy gunfire. The Yak-1 was renowned for its ruggedness, but no aircraft could sustain unlimited damage and continue flying. Lydia estimated she had perhaps 30 minutes of flying time remaining before mechanical failure would force her down. The pursuing German fighters seemed to recognize her deteriorating situation and pressed their attacks with renewed intensity. They had the advantage of operating near their own bases, with unlimited fuel and ammunition available. Lydia's situation grew more desperate with each passing minute as her options continued to diminish. As her aircraft finally began losing altitude uncontrollably, Lydia prepared for what would likely be her final combat mission. The young woman who had begun the day as one of the Soviet Union's most successful fighter pilots now faced the prospect of either dying in the crash or surviving to fight an entirely different kind of battle on the ground. The war was about to become intensely personal in ways she had never imagined.